next lecture is in memory of Otto Neurath, born in 1882 in Vienna. Neurath's philosophy was inextricably linked to pedagogical theory and also, as in Popper's case, political thought. He created the International Foundation for Visual Education in The Hague with his assistance from Vienna and spearheaded the International Unity of Science movement. This lecture is titled Science and Policy in the Era of Globalization and will be delivered by Barbara Harris-White, Emeritus Professor, Oxford University, United Kingdom. This lecture will be chaired by Lord Meghnad Desai, Emeritus Professor, London School of Economics. May I now request Professor Harris and Lord Desai to please begin. Lord Desai, please take over the proceedings.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to chair this lecture by Barbara Harris-White, whom I have known for a very, very long time. She is probably one of the few people who is a development political economist rather than a development economist. She has combined the methods of anthropology along with economic analysis and with a perspective, a redistributive perspective about development. She has extensive knowledge of India, Indian economy, and of course has worked around the world. Oxford is her home. Before that she was in Brighton at the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex. And as you will see, she has won many awards and prizes. I just want to say one thing about Otto Neurath, that while he is very famous for what he did to science, he was one of the few people who actually ran a communist regime, a rather temporary takeover after the end of the First World War in the Hungarian Revolution. And he also proposed what we now call human development as a criterion for development way back in 1919. But we don't have time to go into because I'm not lecturing. Barbara Harris-White is lecturing. Okay, Barbara, off you go. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Before I start, I just want to say a very big thank you for having been invited to this fascinating conference. It's really stretching in many disciplinary directions. It's also a great, and I have to say, unexpected honor to be invited to speak in memory of Otto Neurath, who I understand is a philosopher of the Vienna Circle. This was a group of scientists and philosophers espousing pluralism at the start of the 20th century, and empiricism as well. And as Meghnad hinted, he contributed actively to theories of value in economics, to war planning, to central economic planning, and to the planning of science cities. He also set up museums and was expert in mass communication. So this lecture pays a modest homage to Otto Neurath by looking at science and planning, or science and policy, in very different circumstances from the ones in which he theorized value. That is, our circumstances when we have an era of generalized commodification, including the commodification of science, which seems to have no break at all and is threatening the knowledge commons. Right, I think I've said all that. So let me just go through very quickly my argument, and then I'll make my argument. I will be looking at how science models society and public opinion and policy making. And I'm going to argue that it models it in ways which social scientists would understand as either benign neglect or the rejection of social social sciences and the rejection of the scientific study of policy. I'm then going to turn it round and look at policy models of science, which I find to be depoliticized. I'm then going to look at what has been discovered in the body of research that looks at the politics of science and technology and its relationship to policy. And there, the big theme that I'm going to emphasize is the rise of private interest and hostility towards the state. Now, this is utterly different from the conditions that Neurath was theorizing, central planning and economic planning, and the use of science for the purposes of policy and planning. I'm then turning to the commodification of science and saying that it's got to such a stage without a break that it's going to threaten our knowledge commons on which scientific endeavor depends. And then I will look at the commodification of the state and the commodification of policy and come to a very similar, rather pessimistic conclusion. My evidence is mainly from the UK, even though I've worked on India, but I do think it's useful to air these ideas and to get critical feedback from people in India. Okay. So one knows from decades and decades of debate that science and either humanities or the public sphere and policy have been theorized as being separated, always separated by different kinds of chasm or gulf. C.P. Snow famously had two cultures. Brockman said, no, there are not two, there are three, because he was identifying a culture of the communication, the public communication of science. And since, in the last 20 years, since discourse analysis has become quite an orthodox academic field, you will find, if you go into the literature, multiple cultures of science, studies of labs, studies of specific policy pathways of communication, from which it's impossible to draw a conclusion other than that there are many, many avenues of more or less distorted communication between science and society, science and policy. And now, the thing that I want to explore in this talk, and totally different from the time when Neurath made his contributions, we are in an era when the marketplace or markets are completely naturalized. And I want to ask three questions concerning the naturalization of markets, which at first sight don't have to do with markets, but as I hope to show you, actually are very centrally concerned with markets. Firstly, how does science communicate with society at large, educated lay society, and with policymakers? Secondly, turn it around. How do policymakers see science, the science they want to help them make better policy? And thirdly, in an era when science and knowledge is being marketized and commodified, you may say, pervaded by capitalist relations, what are the discursive effects and the real effects of this situation? Okay, now to do this, I have to borrow from discourse analysis and identify key texts. And I have 4 texts to illustrate the nature of the problem and the kinds of solutions that have been found, which involve markets or market surrogates. So I have a text on biodiversity loss from the IPCC, which is collating, it is tasked with collating the research of scientists for the problems of climate change. The second is from the Royal Society in London. It's called People and Planets. It's about population and the relationship between human beings and the planet. The third is from the Royal Society of Engineering, also in London, and it's about how scientific inventions are converted into commercial profit-making applications, how they should be. And the fourth is from the British Academy, yet again in London, called Punching Our Weight. And it's about the relationship between social science and the British Academy is the apex organisation of social science in Britain, and how they are to communicate with policymakers. Okay, so the first text is called a scientific assessment, and it means a huge team of scientists, specialists in their field, who are summarizing in an overview the potential, the existing discoveries and knowledge, and the problems of ignorance and controversy in given fields. So this one happens to be about biodiversity loss. And it's, to a lay person who's not a scientist, it's very elegantly laid out. But what interests me is what comes at the end of the report when they wish to communicate the results to policymakers and to public opinion and to educated people who wish, many of whom are making society the object of their own research. So the idiom is, science should serve management and policy. And what is invoked is a series of technologies such as decision support tools, ecosystem production functions, and ecological service valuation. Well, everybody around this very big table will understand what is being done here, which is an attempt to use science and technology to value in dollars the problems, the loss to society of biodiversity loss. So policy is invoked as a natural laboratory at the end of this report, but policy is actually externalized in this report. It's a natural laboratory, all right, but it's also a black box. Sorry, I've been leaning on this. Can I get back? I'll have to wait. In the second of the studies called about population and climate change from the Royal Society, we find a consensus document mainly written by scientists, but writing about society. So the problem is posed in completely empiricist terms. The planet is threatened by population increase, by urbanization, and by consumption. And so it follows that there should be changes in consumption. There should be increases in social equality, and the economy should decarbonify. And the energy sector and the economy can have this done to them by political leadership, and it's the job of political leaders to change the models of society and of the economy. Well, again, everybody sitting around this table will see that that's wildly reductive and atheoretical. If you read this report, capitalism isn't mentioned once. And leadership is used as a kind of escape hatch to avoid any other problems. It's the job of leaders to change the materiality of the economy that is causing the pressure of population on the planet. The third, I wish I could get back to this, maybe, there we go. The third is from the Royal Academy of Engineering, and the engineers have invented a concept called the Valley of Death, which is the gulf between inventing something new and having it commercialized to make a profit. And in the Valley of Death, there are all kinds of military metaphors and images which connote all the obstacles which have been tremendously well theorized in social science between invention and the marketing, the retailing of a commodity. I mean, one might be the Innovation Systems School, but there are many, many more. There's a massive literature. And my point is that it never occurs to the engineers to consult the social science literature, but instead embed these Lego terms called, like the Valley of Death. So a state is to pick winners, public-private partnerships are being mobilized to turn innovation into commodities. A workforce is to be skilled. The UK is to develop competitive advantage and through competition policy. And society is a set of widgets that can be tweaked this way and that through an engineering approach to policy. And of course, this, I don't know where to start really, but it completely evades what Tony Giddens has made famous, that society itself changes what social science studies in a double hermeneutic, and that there are actually many, many approaches to the study of society, and that progress requires testing these ideas, testing these approaches. Okay, so how does the British Academy, which is tasked with bringing together the top social scientists in Britain, how do they approach the obverse of that question? Well, they produced a report called Punching Our Weight, which is about the relationship between social science and policy. And they argue policymakers need social science, exactly the research that the scientists seem systematically to reject in their own reports. They need that research. And they can get that research in a dialogue. And they stylize policymakers. I'm sorry, this is moving backwards and forwards. They can do this in a dialogue with policymakers whom they see as firefighting. They see social science research as long-term, peaceful, open-ended, and policymakers firefighting constantly. And there need to be all kinds of bridging activities, which are listed out in this report, between the short-termism of policymaking and the long-termism of social science. And so it's a simple process of coordination. Even though there's a vast literature in social science on the sociology and the politics of policy, which is completely ignored, not just in the scientific assessments, but also in the social science outreach documents on the relationship between social science and policy. And for just two kinds of insights, there's a lot of literature on the risk society and policymaking in the risk society that shows that policymakers don't just need technical knowledge from science, they need conceptual expertise, they need nimbleness to react quickly to all kinds of unforeseen disasters or unexpected events. Conceptual expertise, in other words. And they also need contextual expertise, which is expertise grounded in the realities of experience. What we sometimes dismiss as white noise or ad hocery is actually very central to the expertise of policymakers and bureaucrats. And another set of literature shows policy as being the result of many forces, of which science and technocratic calculations and research is only one, thinking of the role of the media, thinking of the role of the courts, of civil society, of big business, and sometimes even of organized crime. So there are large literatures which exist, which even the British Academy have ignored in their desperate need to simplify the bridge between science and social science and policy. Now let's see if this will stay. So we can turn it round and ask, how is science incorporated by policymakers? And policy is actually itself molded into a science. And here, economics has been hugely important by developing a technique called social cost-benefit analysis, which I don't want to go into in this lecture, but also borrowing from medical science, randomized controlled trials, and procedures called systematic reviews, and incorporating scientists into the machinery of government. All this is in principle very interesting, and again, subject to very large literatures, which I can't go into this afternoon. But just I need to say one or two points relevant to the case I'm trying to build. Social cost-benefit analysis requires us all to value or impute dollar values of various sorts onto projects, onto suggestions, and it is the only technique that's available to answer an official or a bureaucratic question. Is a hospital in Colombo or a steel factory in Kenya the best value for money? That's the kind of question which bureaucrats are emboldened to ask, and the only way you can answer it is with this kind of technique. Now, there are a lot of controversies, and I suppose, in a nutshell, the controversies themselves, which are about how you do this in economics, introduce a kind of instability into things that the method is actually designed to render more certain. So it has a paradoxical effect. Now, what am I talking about? Well, there are big debates about trade-offs, about how you put a dollar value on uncertainty, about how you choose discount rates which bring future costs back into the present, about values of different classes of society and different age groups, about the restriction of the choice of technology to things which are amenable to this way of analyzing them or comparing them, and then of trying to generalize and then really extrapolating from one set of circumstances to another. So, in other words, it's a mainstream technique which is used in government, the controversies of which are pushed carefully under the carpet. Of late, randomized controlled trials for medicine have held a kind of pole position. Randomized controlled trials are very useful for vaccine trials, and they're probably quite useful for certain kinds of question about health and development, education and development, certain aspects of agronomy. But there are colossal problems of assuming that you can find a trial unit, be it a village or a school or whatever, and then compare it with a control or a counterfactual. In society, finding exact controls or exact counterfactuals are very difficult. And the use of this technique, which is rising and rising everywhere, and it's permeating aid-giving bodies, restricts the agenda of what we research to questions which are answerable through this method. So it's absolutely no good for questions which are celebrating diversity or complexity or examining risky or changing conditions, or even other ways of knowing about health and education. All these things are externalized and delegitimized. So that approach has been criticized as technocratic and mechanical, as has the next one, which is systematic reviews, which are a particular kind of review of literature, not what I am doing this afternoon, but which often do not find cause-effect relationships which would be useful for policymakers, not because the cause-effect relationships don't exist, but because the evidence for the cause-effect relationships are not taking the form which is acceptable to systematic review. Okay. And going on to chief scientific advice, all the departments in the British government have chief scientific advisors, which means that inside the British government there is an epistemic community drawn from universities and think tanks and research institutes, so that, according to the chief scientific advisor to the government, decisions in government departments are now based on solid science and engineering. But they aren't. It doesn't happen that way. They've been criticized for uneven influence on both expenditure and on policy. Their science may be adopted, but at other occasions it's also co-opted or blocked or even requested after a decision has been made. So the effects of the incorporation of science into policy is to economize policy, to narrow the field of questions subject to all kinds of randomized controlled trial conditionalities, and to externalize the real, actually existing politics of agenda setting. So whenever science and politics clash, as they have done famously in Britain, it is politics that wins over science. And at the same time, policymakers regard that kind of politics as contaminating. So the final part of my talk is, who gains from this kind of mental closure? Very briefly, David Dixon, who was trained as a mathematician and became expert in science and technology, wrote a book entitled The New Politics of Science. Now, it isn't about India or the UK, it's about the US, but again, we can draw lessons from it. He looks at the relationship over time, it's a very thick book of history, between science as an entity, the American state as an entity, and American interests. And despite Friedmanite invocations that the state shouldn't meddle in science, what we find is that the American federal state meddles enormously in science and basically funds basic science, whereas the constituent states of the US are funding the science behind the military-industrial complex, which is welcomed by the labor force of all the decentralized sites in which that takes place. And in a nutshell, what he finds is that there are three kinds of relationships. If you see it as a triangle, science, the state, and industry, there's a relationship between science and the state in which science is subordinated to capital, to industry, and to political party interests. Between the state and industry, there's all kinds of accommodation through funding, public-private partnerships, transfers of patents, of inventions that have been paid for publicly and patented privately, together with an increasingly anti-state ideology. And the third element of this is between science and private capital, in which the progress of science is increasingly privatized through patents and intellectual property rights and becomes an element in America's international competition policy. In other words, becomes an element in America's foreign policy. That's what he has to show in a very long, learned study. So there's a paradox that emerges at the end, that experts are niched inside the state, but at the same time, the science that is manifested through this expertise is undermined and private interests prevail. And yet, there's an epistemic setup which denies and is hostile to this political setup analyzed in those open terms. So why is science and policy so averse to politics? I will race through this because, I don't know how I can wrap up. Well, I'll race through this to wrap up. We can answer the question. The question is a very difficult question to answer. And in my paper, which everybody is very welcome to read, I don't pretend to have the full answer. But what I'm going to do is look at the role of the process of commodification in providing us with insights which help answer that question. We live in an era, and I think this is true of India, where knowledge is being commodified. We have a concept coming from the World Bank and the OECD of knowledge economy, knowledge society, and the knowledge commons. And there's a kind of paradox in operation there, because the knowledge commons are necessary as a nutrient base for the knowledge economy, in which knowledge is being privatized, in other words, no longer kept by the producers, but freely available to anybody who can buy it. So privatized and made more accessible, and a whole host of institutions. And in India, we have private universities in their hundreds, and all the constitutive relationships of informal tuitioning, capitation fees, etc., all privatized. So the knowledge economy is necessary for the reproduction of society, and it's a nutrient base for the privatized knowledge economy, but the privatized knowledge economy is privatizing the knowledge commons, which is a dangerous situation. Okay, and I will stop in a minute. And if I'd had more time, and perhaps in Q&A, I would expand a little bit on how not only is knowledge being commodified, but the state is being commodified, and policy is being commodified. Just in a sentence, the agenda subcontracted out to think tanks and consultancies, policy drafting subcontracting out to legal drafting firms, information not held in the state but subcontracted out, a decline in competence to evaluate in the state, a decline in institutional memory, and so on and so forth. We could take it up in questions. Okay, so what is to be done? I think what is to be done is that both science and social science, we have a duty to define what is needed to ensure the survival of a non-commodified knowledge-based, non-commodified science. And they need to be well articulated with policymaking in ways which are not mutually damaging, which in my paper I try to show is currently the case. And in this interpretive role, policy decisions which bubble up into the public domain need to be viewed from three standpoints where we are all involved. That of the proponent, the invested interest or the vested interest putting forward a policy. That of the state for its implication for public resources. And finally, that of the larger public interest. These days, the public interest is defined as the sum total of private interests. That is a contradiction in terms because we know that private interests are in conflict. We need to reinstate the concept of the public interest. We need to be vigilant. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Me having pushed Barbara to finish on time. Who's going to ask questions? Yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Barbara. It was such a fascinating presentation and the talk. I have a question, and I think it also has some connotation in context of the current economic policies. So we increasingly see in today's time that the technology, science, and knowledge is being presented as a problem solver for the complex issues of the society. But increasingly we see, maybe due to information asymmetry, that instead of addressing the problem, it's putting a new kind of a diktat which is further magnifying the problem. So for example, there's a policy in place where technology is trying to reduce the income inequality, but after we evaluate after a decade, it has further increased income equality. So how do you see this paradox? Of course, you did talk briefly about it, but we'd like to you to expand a bit more on it. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, Joseph.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting analysis. It's about China and Russia. I don't know if you know a little bit these countries, but it's quite fascinating to see, especially in China, where they invest hugely in sciences, that the state has retained a strong position. And I don't see, for instance, in China, this model of private interest capturing the state, no? So to what extent, A, your analysis stands for, let's say, most Western countries, and particularly maybe US at first, but I don't know, France tried to retain that balance between private interest and public interest. But anyway, that model is for Western countries. Then, if you know a little bit about China, can you tell us if that model worked for China. And you will understand the implication of my question is, it seems to me that the Western model is going to a failure because of that private interest prevalence today, whereas the Chinese model, keeping that public interest into account, maybe for bad reason because this is Communist Party, but anyway they have this vision, is having a much better result to a certain extent, including social result, and the image of China in the developing world looks much, much better than the image of the Western world. So that's a little bit complicated, but if you could elaborate on that, and I think it will help us to understand the big fight today in terms of leadership, no? Thank you.
One more question, yeah.
Thanks. This was a great presentation. Can you hear me? Is it okay? My question is that the way you presented about the problem of the incorporation of the policy, science into policy and the obverse, it appeared as if you're trying to suggest that there is an agenda. I am submitting to you just a small comment and then a question, that also from the insider perspective of a civil servant, one of the biggest challenges that the governance issue raises in debate is that there is a lack of evidence-based policy making. And the researchers, science and all, it is deemed to be bringing that lack, minimizing that lack, bringing the evidence, bringing the knowledge, bringing the research to make policy much more informed. Now, some distortions may be happening. Randomized controlled trial may not be able to get the right control. The methodology can be refined, but this is not all set for commodification of knowledge. There is a need of that knowledge base to inform the policy making. And just the opposite, when the politics dominates the policy making, I can tell you from some experience, which is again not a universal proposition, and that is this, that they have a set agenda of what policies to be made so that that can buy votes, and they then coerce the delegitimization of knowledge and science and say, we know the best for the voters, you make this policy. So it's just the opposite. It's not the politics which is, where you say that the politics, they are averse to politics, it's the politics which is averse to them. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Yeah, can you keep it short, please?
My question is, how are the variable and semi-variable factors can be controlled through science and policy in policy matters?
We can't hear you. You got to have, it's like Frank Sinatra, have it very close to your mouth.
How the variable and semi-variable factors can be controlled through science in policy matter?
Hello? Can you hear? Okay, thank you. Thank you for the questions, which are very demanding and which I probably can't answer. The first was about the paradox that science and technology is brought in to solve complex problems, but in fact creates more complex problems. I think that is true, and I don't have the answer except a really deep revolution in what Sen calls democratic deliberation, in the communication of science, in the widespread discussion of science, and of politics, and of policy, none of which is happening. So since it's not happening, what we as social scientists can do is to trace the narrowing of the policy agenda. What is a correct kind of policy question? What is the appropriate scientific evidence? We need to stand outside it and provide a critique, because the current way of proceeding doesn't allow that critique, and science only makes progress through that critique, and policy says it needs good science. So we really have no alternative but to use as much energy as we can muster socially to provide that critique. But as for an answer, I don't think that's for this afternoon. The second question was about China, and I think you are right that what I've described is not really under the title of globalization, it's under the title of global commodification, and China has held out in crucial respects. The Communist Party allows much more debate, I think, within it, once a subject like pensions of migrants, yes? That kind of subject takes years and years to be accepted as a policy subject, but it will then be widely debated inside the party. The party will send scientists out all over the world to look at how pensions for migrants work. It's then discussed in China. China is big enough to have action experiments, and the results of those experiments are then discussed. So I think you are right, and this may not be generalizable, but I think that the relationship between social science and policy in China is much more close. It's much more the sort of relationship that Otto Neurath was theorizing about in the 1920s, because big capital has not yet commodified the state or policy in China. So thank you very much for that intervention. The third was, I think, about the value of incorporating science into policy making. Yes, I didn't hear it very well, but I thought it was a defense of randomized control trial type research feeding into policy. And my only response would be it can do that. And I know that the Columbia Poverty Lab does that. It conducts experiments and it feeds them into policy. But there is another literature which is saying it may do that, but it's actually narrowing the agenda of what policy questions bureaucrats feel entitled to ask. So it's doing a good thing in sense raising the bar for evidence and trying to feed scientific evidence into policy, but it's lowering the bar in the sense that it's excluding a lot of policy questions which are too complicated to be sorted out by randomized controlled trials. And I'm using that phrase really to cover all these scientized, depoliticized methods that are being transferred from science to the policy sphere. So I agree with you and I disagree with you. And the last question, I'm terribly sorry, I would like to answer it. It was something to do with countervailing factors, but I didn't hear the question. So I can't answer a question that I didn't hear. So I really apologize, and we must discuss it in a break. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Lord Desai. I request Dr. Sunita Lal to present the memento to our speaker. To present my book to Advi.
It's called Indian Capitalism in Development. You can buy it if you want, which you should.